When there's anterior shoulder pain, I don't know that it always matters what the specific anatomy is. I guess if you did have an MRI and you knew it was one structure but not the other, then you probably have a more narrow focused approach to what special exercises you would do at that segmental level. Other exercises may not be valuable, and when I try to explain this to folks, hey, what do you think it is? I'm like, I don't relish that question, because we know it doesn't matter, particularly if they're getting better and their function is not like this. But I say, hey, you know what a row home is? I always think of row homes from Northeast Philly, where I used to have a very good friend who grew up there. I describe the structures of the anterior shoulder here as this big row of Northeast Philly row homes. And the thing that's interesting about these row homes, or old, maybe duplexes or multifamily homes that share a roof, if they don't have a firewall in the attic, let's say you're at one end of the block over here and there's a fire in the attic of that house, because it was so old, the row homes are all going to take on fire, because there's no retardant in between each of the individual properties, because they all have all these shared walls, but there's no wall through the attic. People understand that visual, that analogy. And like, that's kind of how it works here, because you've got this groove that goes through the middle. Yeah, there's bone that comes up, but that is not a fire retardant to inflammatory inflammation. And in the middle of the groove is your biceps tendon. That's one potential culprit. You can run special tests to try to rule one thing out, but we know that the sensitivity and specificity aren't quite elite to answer this type of question that we also know may not even matter. On the outside of that intertubercular groove, you have the supraspinatus, the infraspinatus, and the teres minor tendon. On the inside, you have the subscapularis, the lats, and the pec major. And of course, this individual slices of this is where this starts and this ends probably is what we're deciding when we're dissecting something, rather than it being the truth. Now, I'm not saying that they're all one big thing, but they're closer to one big thing because there's nothing to separate them. So basically what I'm suggesting is that when one of these tendons is even mildly pathological and there's an inflammatory response, they're almost all going to be affected. And that might be why some of these special tests for impingement might not be super specific in determining which structure has a lesion. I think a better way to go about these things is to at least start with a more global celiac approach, where you're just going to create 4 categories of pain and strength. For instance, if something has no pain and full strength, or no pain and no weakness, then it's normal. If something has no pain and complete weakness, then you have a full tear. Where if you have a full tear, you know you have a problem. Like, that's grounds for imaging, because no pain really would mean that you have gone through this and has been such for some time. All of the nerves are cut and you're not even getting a signal, nociceptive signal through to the system. So that's a major problem. So now you have, what about the intermediaries? What happens when you have pain and strength? That would probably be somewhere of a mild to moderate tear. Or a different type of mild to moderate tear would be no pain but weakness. But again, that would probably be a mild lesion, if any. You'd just be weak. But again, using your hand for a manual muscle test or other type of very low learning curve type of muscle test, you're not necessarily measuring strength. You're measuring function, like basic minimum standard function. So that row home analogy is one that I would use to try to explain why is it okay to take this buckshot approach. Now, if you had the MRI, okay, we could be a little bit more specific, but in that case, you probably don't need one. Now, if you had the celiac approach, and I recently had a young lady who did an O'Brien's test where you could push down with my pinky finger, but she had no pain. Obviously, we know O'Brien's test, if it has pain and you break, then you should be investigating a labral tear. Well, good news. Probably don't need contrast to investigate the rotator cuff and the labrum, and it turned out it was just the supraspinatus, which obviously would make a lot more sense for something that was weak but not painful. But it probably should have been a much bigger tear, so there was certainly a psychosocial component to her performance. And also, miraculously, once the MRI came back, her shoulder was quite strong. So very interesting stuff. But yeah, I use that row home example. I'm sure there's other areas in the body. Not only is there value of treating neighbors, these guys are all very, very close neighbors. Again, you have basically 7 tendons that are attaching to that anterior shoulder, and I'm sure there's overlap, and that's important to recognize, because when you have issue in one, which is very, very isolated, it'll show up very globally as if a lot of other tendons and or their associated muscle tissue is also compromised.